Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the CECAN webinar. It's a bit of a strange environment. I can't see any of you or hear any of you, but I hope that you can all hear and see me. We're going to get started in a timely way today. We've already got plenty of attendees that are here. So I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name's Stuart Astle. I'm a founder member of the CECAN Research Centre. I'm also an independent consultant and trainer. And you can find more about me if you're interested at strategyandEvidence.com, but I'm not going to tell you very much about me because today's not about that. For those of you that aren't familiar with CECAN, CECAN is an ESRC funded research centre. It stands for the Centre for Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus, and been around since 2016, so it's been running for quite a long time now, and looks at transforming the practice of policy evaluation across food, energy, water and environmental domains to make it fit for a complex world. What's certain is that we've actually broken out to a certain extent from just those initial areas, and now CECAN looks at doing evaluating complexity across a broader swathe of places. So that's really what CECAN's all about. And if you go to the website at cecan.ac.uk, then you'll find out that there's a lot of work that's been done, particularly on things like webinars, research, practice notes, that are really practical resources for lots of people that want to and have to evaluate things under complexity. My next job is to well, let's do a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce Catherine. So there's a vast number of attendees here already, and more people are joining every second, as I can see on my control panel for Zoom. So first of all, thanks to everyone for having registered, and thanks even more to those that attended and got here beautifully on time. So many thanks for that. We're going to have, after Catherine's presented to us, we're going to have a question and answer session, and the way that you can get your questions to Catherine is through written means. There's a question and answer panel which operates within Zoom, and they will appear, and I will be putting the questions that appear in that question and answer panel to Catherine after she's given us her thoughts on today's subject. So that's the way that that's going to happen. I'm just going to double check to make sure there's nothing else that I say in there. Yeah, that's right. So it's through that control panel. Now, I don't know if you've got a chat panel. I haven't. So anything you put in chat, I'm not going to see. It has to go through that question and answer panel. The other thing to say is that, as I said, there's many resources available on the CECAN website. Today's webinar is being recorded, and it will be put up onto the CECAN website at cecan.ac.uk. So if you do unfortunately have to drop out for any reason, and it's going to be much better live because you'll catch the question and answers and have a chance to actually ask some questions. But if you do have to drop out, you'll be able to find this there later on. So just a quick introduction to Catherine. So Catherine Currie, she's up in the chillier part of northern Britain, up in Scotland, independent evaluator based up there, and someone that I've worked with reasonably extensively over the past maybe 6 or 7 years. And the best thing I think I can say about Catherine is that we work together really well. And what's particularly interesting is I enjoy working with Catherine because her skills and knowledge are really complementary to the side of things that I work on. So I'm more of a quantitative person. I'm a methodologist. I'm not what anyone would ever call a pure evaluator, but I'm someone that gets involved a lot in evaluations. And Catherine's got a huge set of complementary skills that she brings, and we have great time meshing those skills together. And so today she's going to be presenting something that is a broader sort of reflection and broader interest than CECAN sometimes focuses on. As you'll know if you know CECAN, sometimes we dig deep down into specific methods, but Catherine's sort of breaking out of those boxes really and giving a broader thought across using contribution analysis today. There's a set of slides, she's going to talk to those slides, and I don't think really there's much else to say apart from I know that whenever Catherine speaks, it's always interesting, and so I'm really looking forward to what she's got to say. So that's it. I'll hand over to Catherine, and remember that you can put your questions in for the question and answer session as you go along. So if things occur to you, there's no harm in us taking questions of clarity or specific questions on particular issues, but also, you know, we're looking at sort of reflections, and this is a space for reflection as well as just asking questions about the things that Catherine is specifically presenting. So, you know, whatever you feel, put that into the question and answer box as we go along, and then hopefully we'll have collected plenty of things by the time we get to that session. So hand over to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Thank you very much for the introduction. That was very, very kind of you, and straight back at you in terms of enjoying working with you. Many thanks also to CECAN for this opportunity. So welcome everybody, and welcome to this session. I'll just start moving my slides forward. So here we are. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so just listening to some points I've got to share about my reflections on using contribution analysis. I decided on using a broader, as Stuart said, reflection and learning space because it is January, it is a new year, and I thought, let me help create and convene a space where we can all sit down with our lunch. I hope some of you are enjoying your lunch, and just reflect a little bit. So, a little bit about me. As Stuart said, I'm an independent consultant and been working in the space of international development now for over 18 years. I've got a background as a management consultant and organisation development specialist. So this sort of experience has merged into the field of international development. I really relish complexity, and I love grappling with the challenges that I've experienced over the time in organisational monitoring, evaluation and learning. When I took the time to actually look at my CV in more detail, I found that I've actually been involved in more than 30 evaluations and team-led numerous, a great deal of those. And I've been really lucky to work with a great diversity of clients, you know, from intergovernmental organisations to international NGOs, philanthropic foundations, multilateral institutions. So my experience is very broad, very general in many ways, mostly based in theory-based evaluations. And most recently, to give you a flavour of what I've been involved in, last year I was part of the team with IOD Park who did the formative evaluation of UNICEF's strategic plan, which I believe has just been published actually. And I've also been working with a private Swiss foundation to develop their strategic learning and evaluation system. So lots of different types of work, and this piece of work that I'd like to share with you today is based on some work that I did with Laura Hopkins. So what are we looking at today? So what I want to do is just share some of the lessons from implementing contribution analysis, particularly under time and resource constraints. So what I mean by that is the actual practical application of a method when you're in a consulting assignment. Share some tips and tools that I found helpful, again, very much building on the reflection I did from the UK evaluation paper that Laura and I presented in 2019. You know, and really listen to you as well in the Q&A, you know, do these experiences resonate with you? So as Stuart said, you know, not so much, please do ask me questions, but equally share anything that resonates, anything that you've reflected upon that you feel is of value today. So let's move into actually how we're going to go through our time today in the webinar. What I want to do is just remind us really of the gold standard, refresh our memory really, and have a little check-in that we're all reflecting on the same thing. So what contribution analysis is. Then I'll move into really what my experience has been of the application of contribution analysis, so the reality of that. And then, as I said, sort of finish with some thoughts I've had about the pros and cons, some of the trade-offs, some of the things you might want to consider if you're using this method, and as you go forward in perhaps as an evaluator or somebody with interest in this area. Okay, so let me just check in on where I am and how I'm doing. I think that's all fine. So let's now move on to the gold standard. Right. So Dr. John Main is the person behind contribution analysis. So in 2001, he really looked at a way this method really fits within a theory-based framework that looks explicitly at processes and mechanisms for change. So we all know how important it is to try to find a way of understanding contribution within complexity. So I find it interesting because it offers a step-by-step approach, which I'm about to take you through, and it's designed to help managers, researchers, policymakers, arrive at conclusions about the contribution their programme or initiative or partnership, for example, has made to particular outcomes. As I said before, this presentation is building on reflection that I did since the 2019 presentation with Laura Hopkins. So a lot of those reflections were based on advocacy evaluations. So you'll hear time and time again, just some thoughts coming up about if you were to use this in a policy advocacy frame. But I think the essential value of contribution analysis is it offers an approach designed to reduce uncertainty about the contribution that initiative is making. And it tries to really bring in that complexity. What other roles what other actors and factors have there been in this space? What are some of the alternative explanation? So it really, for me, brings a bit of a greater rigor and more of a systematic approach to thinking about this method. I mentioned advocacy evaluations because I think it's really important to remember that in those contexts, when you have something so complex with actors who perhaps don't want to share all their private methods with which they've actually arrived at their outcome, what they wanted to achieve, contribution analysis can be sensitively implemented and can really help people understand what their role was in achieving perhaps some change within a very complex policy environment. For this presentation, there are definitely different cases or different ways of using contribution analysis. And today I'm focusing more on how you assess the direct and indirect influence of initiatives on outcomes, okay? So when we look for evidence for each initiative's contribution to, for example, an intermediate outcome or to a final policy outcome, okay? At this point, I definitely recommend a paper if you're interested any further, is the 2017 paper, Contribution Analysis and Policy Work, Assessing Advocacy's Influence, and that's by Kane, Levine, Oriens and Reinelt, Centre for Policy for Evaluation Innovation. So let's have a little look at this gold standard. I've left you long enough on my step screen. So the question Dr. John Main wanted to answer was, in light of multiple factors influencing a result, has the intervention, or I prefer the word initiative actually, made a noticeable contribution to an observed result, and in what way? So you did this through the following steps. You set out the causal problem. What is the cause-effect issue that you want to address? Really work with your client, work with your team to understand that. Then develop a theory of change. So we all perhaps have come across theories of change before. So really start to interrogate with your client, if you were absent, good counterfactual thinking, what if anything would have been different about the policy outcome? Start to really think through some of those connections. As we know, it's critical to sort of really start to unearth assumptions that we have, and particularly at this stage to think about risks. What are the risks that you have identified? Well, because you've identified the connections in your theory, what are the risks associated with those not taking place? Very neatly then, you gather existing evidence. So your documentation, perhaps you even have some transcripts from some previous evaluations. Who knows what people will be able to share with you. And so you really start to then assemble what I call the contribution story. So you get to your first draft. You start to really bring in that rigor and discipline in your mind about your assessing a contribution claim here. So let's think about this in terms of the outcome, what the different actors did, any alternative explanations, and what perhaps your client or the partnership you're involved in or the coalition was trying to achieve. Essentially, then, the next step is to gather additional evidence. So particularly here, this is where you might go out and get new primary evidence. You might just want to start to understand a real plethora of actors. So for many clients, in my experience, it's really important that every significant actor or factor is covered or accurately acknowledged. You can imagine if a contribution story is published as an annex as part of an evaluation, the evaluation team, you need to have a real high level of credibility, so that because the story is also a representation of that sort of the trusting relationship that you have, and very crucially, and I'll come back to this later, as a principle, as an evaluator, to do no harm, so that you are always thinking as you're developing your story, gathering the evidence about credibility and making sure you do not damage any of the existing relationships, particularly in the advocacy context. And then it's very simple. You then revise the contribution story. So this is the beautiful steps. We don't get anywhere if we don't start with steps. However, in my experience, and as I said, when Laura and I reflected in preparation for the paper we wrote in 2019, it was very, very different. Okay. So here we have the nice steps. And here really is my reality. Okay. So I'm weaving, hopefully, through this presentation, a little bit of a story. So here is what I think, okay? Each of these steps boiled down to a few words on a page. They look unimposing, don't they? They look like that's pretty straightforward, but actually experiences that, they overlap, they repeat. But actually, this is one of the key strengths for me of contribution analysis, that iterative nature of it, and time again, when I've been reflecting as well, particularly after the pandemic and the pieces of work I've been doing, I think you really, well, in my professional work at the moment, I am moving away from stepwise approaches. I'm trying to embrace the complexity of the world we live in and really therefore adapt the methods I have. So the strength of contribution analysis, I believe, is in this iterative approach. So what have been my main reflections? So I'd like to share just a few with you here. Setting out the problem at the beginning can be a real challenge. As we all know, if you actually start to work with clients in order to understand an outcome, it might be very difficult because they may actually want to focus on, perhaps in the case of one advocacy evaluation, a financial outcome. So was national level budget allocated to a particular area, and it was in global health research and development, but does that work with the time frame that the client has for the scope of work that you're looking at? So you start to have to come and go a little bit on actually, can we set out the causal problem at the moment? And does the time frame work for how we're fitting in the evidence? So it really matters the level at which you're trying to set the problem. So I think it's really good at this point, to step back and ask yourself, is the causal problem appropriately complex even to warrant the use of that contribution analysis? So, do really reflect at the beginning. Another couple of thoughts, particularly about theory of change, for those who like theory of change approaches, I'm right there with you. I very much support them as a tool. So it's a tool to enhance learning, and developing a theory of change takes time and commitment, as we know. So having it as part of a process here, there's obviously a need to be smart and pragmatic about what level of detail can you actually achieve in this, and understanding which elements of the theory of change are most important. So again, going back to those connectors, what are the connections in my theory about how I understand what change I want to look at? What contribution claim do I want to understand? So, for example, we know that to identify the contribution perhaps that A made to B, we need to give credit to other influencing factors. So perhaps just remain open to the fact that you will be reworking that theory of change. It's not going to be static. So you'll be coming back to it. You'll get more evidence as you start to gather evidence. You think, that's not quite right. I just need to rework that a little bit. And then as you speak with people, you hear, and you probe more, which is another point I come back to, is the skills required to do contribution analysis. You start to unearth other assumptions that people have. So again, keep coming back to it. As I said, TOCs aren't understood in the same way by everybody. I really like to use them as a tool, but if you're working with a client or in a space where it is more of a tick box exercise, what I did then in that case was I developed an additional part of the contribution story, which I can go into later, which helped to sort of explore more elements which I knew were important. The next point, as always, you go in you will be greeted with your wonderful zip file of all your documents. Not always, not always is the existing evidence available. It can be difficult to access, or perhaps weak. You know, I had one situation where a major stakeholder that I understood from the work I'd been doing, that was a very important interview, but this person was non-contactable because it was just after an election. So I couldn't get a critical piece of evidence. You know, I couldn't get the part of the claim that was going to really help me write up the contribution story. So again, it was about maintaining that relationship with your client, the expectations of what you can get, and equally, when you have, perhaps you did get a piece of evidence, actually understanding that perhaps you need to drop it or put it to one side because it's perhaps a private strategy that was used, and they don't want it as part of an evidence base. So it can obviously inform your thinking, but isn't formally included. And I think just really remaining really open to the fact that evidence, hopefully you'll find evidence that's contradictory. I would hope, hopefully you'll find evidence that really perhaps makes things are inconclusive for you. So the validity of the claim, you might just say, is actually inconclusive. So when you're gathering all this evidence, you know, keep going, keep going. The next point around the actual draft contribution story. Now, in my experience, again, what is a contribution story can vary greatly, and I think that's absolutely fine. So one of the examples I gave before about not quite getting there with the theory to the level that I needed the theory of change, what we did was we developed a separate section in the contribution story where we looked at the capacities of the coalition that was involved. So we started to look a little bit at the organisation development. So therefore, the ability of the organisation to undertake certain strategies and tactics in order to achieve the change or the outcome. And this was really welcomed by the client. What that enabled them to do, again, being very aware of where your piece of work sits, was look at sort of the strategy refresh that they were having and looking at who they were funding and why. So, and how they could support organizations to develop further. Just making sure I've covered all that off for you. Yeah, I think the thing I would say though, if you could put the contribution story in lights at the moment, I would. Like that would be the thing that you focus in on. And when you start to gather all that additional evidence, really think, to what extent have you been able to identify, test, and validate your contribution claim? You know, as you gather that additional evidence, again, the reality is, to what extent can you really explore those alternative explanations? You know, to what extent have you been able to interview other actors? You know, so around this point, I would say in the process, things start to get condensed a little bit. You know, you're working with grantees and others to look over the stories. Perhaps you've got multiple stories that you're working on. I've had that as well. You know, one is perhaps more analytically sound than another. So you really need to start to build some coherence, particularly for your final product, across these, and look at where you need to put your evaluative time and your evaluative skill set in order to build that. So you're revising and doing your contribution story all at the same time. So, you know, I hope what I'm giving you a sense of here is that it's less up and down. It's less sort of one step after the other, and it's more, you know, up and down and up and down. And you're really looking at your contribution story, trying to work out what evidence, what gaps do you still have? How do you build in more evidence? What does that mean for the original theory? Do you need to adjust what you're going after? Yeah, so I think always remembering that when you're doing this, really fitting it in with the purpose of your evaluation. You know, it's important to understand your contribution story and to ensure that it has utility to all of your stakeholders. So, you know, as you keep going through this, keep persevere. It's definitely worth it. Okay, so this is the process. These are some of my observations over time and some examples of things that I've done and how to address some of the challenges. And now what I want to share with you are just really some of the lessons that I've had. So how has this all crystallized for me? The first thing is really start at the end, which sounds perhaps counterintuitive. And what do I mean by that? So it really helps to get the scope and the level of detail appropriate for the contribution story. So if you start to focus in on the outcome, keeping the causal problem there, but focus actually on the outcome, try to focus in on the role of the organization, perhaps, and other factors. That really helps to bring the story together. But as I said, there's no substitute for just keep on running up and down the story. And the story in general benefits from a little bit of background. It benefits from a section on the ecosystem and the context within which you're writing this. You need to stipulate the change itself, why that change is important, and start to, unpick some of the roles and the alternative explanations. And then all of that builds, in my mind, to sort of a summary at the top, which I'll talk about in a moment. The next thing I'd certainly say is accommodate uncertainty. Again, this is just, the art of the possible. With certain time, certain resources, certain deadlines, it's not always been possible to go back and revise the story as often as I would have liked. With some clients, it's been more of an issue, but there are ways to increase the comfort level with where you've managed to get to. And I'll give some examples of that. And that's very much dependent on how your client is interacting with this story and what they need it for. But overall, the way that I work is to always remain, fully transparent about where I have less confidence. And, and of course, in an evaluation, this is absolutely important. One of my observations just coming back after the pandemic and with 2 further years of sort of consultancy experience, or 2 to 3 years now, is using this method inside organizations. So less as an independent evaluator and more about sort of accompanying and thinking about the role of contribution analysis within that. And I think there's growing acceptance, in my professional opinion, of the complexity of change, and they need to adapt a little bit and learn throughout initiatives and try to embed some of this so that as you work through the story might be taken on by other people within an organization. So things are just certainly shifting a little bit, but of course, amongst other researchers, I must out my recency bias in that one. It's clearly because that's where I've come from and the specific consultancies I've been involved in. So be interested to hear any comments on that. Next point, knowing when enough is enough. Lovely to be able to know that, isn't it? This is a real trick. As I said, working as part of an evaluation, working up several stories, you're aiming for consistency, but sometimes you need to accept less analytically sound stories. Again, if you've been transparent about the data sources, you've been in contact about the quality of data, availability of interviewees, your ability to triangulate findings, hopefully none of this is a shock, really. One of the things I have been in a situation where, I needed an advocacy coalition partners interview, some new primary evidence to verify an alternative explanation, but I wasn't granted the interview. So I think, there's a need to accept these limits with humility. It's not going to be perfect. And as I said before, we go in there to do no harm. So there may be reasons why certain interviews aren't granted. There's particularly with advocacy ones, there's a broader political context. The other thing I've done is obviously to get to what is enough is sort of trying to manage the boundaries of the process with the client. That's helped me out of some trickier situations. But really what it comes down to is strong evaluator skills and interpersonal skills, I would say. So when you're interviewing, really for contribution analysis particularly, I said before, it brings that discipline and the systematic approach. I really feel like if when you're interviewing, you need to probe even further about responses that are given to you to identify influence, try to understand in your mind where they're coming from. How does that relate to an alternative explanation that's growing, that perhaps is a little bit more fertile in your mind when you're speaking to that interviewee, and really, of course, understand the interests of your different data sources. So where are they coming from? This is really important so that you can, as correctly as possible, interpret the explanations that they offer for example, why a policy change came about. Bringing people along in the journey, again, in my opinion, it's about, classic consulting skills, updating your team, building that trust and understanding, and that contribution analysis and the building of the story can be part of a broader process of sense making and a broader analytical process. Particularly if you have, in a couple of evaluations, if I've done this, you've been able to discuss these prior to submitting an evaluation report to really create a space to have that critical mindset, a safe place to have that critical mindset. But as I said before, it's about doing no harm, first principle as an evaluator. Do no harm to any of those relationships, and be honest about honestly assess how you think perhaps a policy change came about, and do so with diplomacy, because things can sometimes be highly contentious, as we know. The next thing I find, actually more and more, this is an even more recent observation, and I did a little bit of digging on this actually when I was thinking about this, is I'm hoping currently to be able to combine contribution analysis with another method. I'm looking at using it with most significant change, but it'll be more like a story of change. So trying to understand how that comes together has led me to believe that it's really a very powerful method to be used with others, because it's methodologically neutral. So what do I mean by that? I mean that it doesn't specify the means used to collect the evidence or assess the strength of evidence, so it can be easily combined. And when I started to have a look, I found that Barbara Bafani and John Main suggest using it with process tracing, which I've done training on. I've not used it officially yet, but again, very interesting if you think about, so process tracing will go into detail about different kinds of evidence, and it discusses them as being necessary and sufficient, to confirm or disconfirm a causal explanation. So I think there's that analogy of the smoking gun, not particularly non-violent communication, but you know what I mean. So that idea that there's the bit of evidence that will tell you yes or no. And I think that's quite interesting, and I can see why it would bring rigor for certain types of clients. So that's one to think about. I haven't done that one. And then I know others have combined it with outcome harvesting. So again, you could see if, you've got a client or you yourself are struggling with the theory, you haven't got the documentation, an outcome harvesting process would be really interesting. And then that would then help you to focus in on which outcome did you want to look at more specifically for the contribution story. So the next point, reflect on what your role is and who the audience is. I mean, I think I've been bringing that up quite a bit today. I mean, I'm a great believer in you bring your whole self to work, don't you? So it's the understanding the role you have in creating demand for the type of critical analysis you hope to present, and that space for sense making, I think, which can be related more broadly to those of us and those of you who are listening today who are monitoring, evaluation, and learning practitioners. So, we want to be sharing information and evidence that we can share in order to help to course correct or adapt, what's happening. So just remember about that broader place that you're working with. And I'm always trying to think about the use of the evidence or the story to feed into decision making, to try to improve, iterate, and step forward in what we're doing. So the influence of systems thinking, as I've sort of said before, and as I outlined earlier, more and more this is the place that I come from, less from a results chain perspective, less from a waterfall approach. We live in a dynamic and complex world. I would like the methods that I choose to use or work with clients to be able to adapt to that. So I think when I stand back and I look at this method inside of that, I think it's still highly relevant and still very, very useful, because you can include, as I said, that sort of the ecosystem part. And there's another potential way also of bringing that together called timelines, if you've ever used a timeline. So I think the focus here is remembering that you want to get a good enough contribution story that doesn't overclaim. So that's the important point here for me. Okay, so that was a little bit of a run through of contribution analysis in terms of its steps, in terms of my observations of those steps, the reality, and here's have been some of my lessons. And I think, you know, to conclude this part of the discussion is really just to say that, again, I really feel that the value of contribution analysis lies in its systematic approach to a complex causal problem, you know. So I would absolutely, you know, agree with Dr. John Main, you know, in a humble way, obviously, his method, to say that, you know, try to specify and focus on what the problem is that you're exploring. Do try to construct that TOC, you know, that really tries to identify the most relevant causal linkages. Get all that evidence in as much as you can to confirm and disconfirm, and look at your assumptions. Place all of that within your context, you know, tell a story using the contribution story, but also, for example, with a timeline. I can come on to an example of that in a bit. And, you know, the more you can rewrite that story, the more you can go up and down with your evidence, revisit your theory in terms of the linkages, the stronger it will be. You know, this really is a process for learning about what worked and what didn't. Just keep going up and down. Keep going up and down would be my encouragement to you. So what I want to do now is just leave you with a few examples of different ways to perhaps present parts of a contribution story, which I hope will be useful and come from some of the work that I've done. So as I've sort of said, you know, I love to work in complexity, with complexity, but you need to work with the reality of the clients that you're working with, the department that you're working with, and the reality is some clients love simplified rated tables, which, you know, tell them at a glance what the contribution was, you know. So here, if I can take you through what you see on the screen here. So at the top you have outcome, the first outcome, or the outcome itself that you were analysing the contribution claim against. And I've called it "this exciting thing happened in the world," right? So you're after that. You see the right-hand column there where it says factors. Okay, so this is where you start to put down that right-hand column, the factor, the reason why this thing happened, a second reason why it happened, a third reason, I wouldn't go much further than that, third reason why that happened. So again, that analytical process of running through the story will help you crystallize what are the key factors that led to this outcome. Then you can say the next column to the left, how much did the organization contribute to that reason? So we've got some different colors here. You could use ratings depending on what you wanted. And then the next column would be, and how important was that reason for the thing that happened? So you start to really contextualize again. So use those. Have been clients have been satisfied with this type of approach. It doesn't mean that you need to change the rest of the contribution story. We've added these in at the end, even if they want a sort of a better sort of at a glance, what actually have we done? But as I said, you know, and you'll see the comments on the left there, you know, there's no mention here of the strength of evidence. Or perhaps my confidence in those findings, or our confidence as an evaluation team. And it doesn't allow for the idea that the influence is perhaps unrealistic in amongst what's happening here. So again, how did that work alongside your theory of change? And it's a linear presentation. So therefore it seems linear, or certainly the comfort zone is then linear analysis, isn't it? So so just bear that in mind. If somebody wants something like this, it does work. Here's an example of what has worked. But I think, you know, trying to move further into understanding your level of confidence is perhaps, it is important. It's important to do that. Okay, so that's kind of the way I'm happy to do things like that, and I'm happy to come up with sort of those summary pictures alongside a contribution story. You you know, and I'm sure perhaps some of you with the male experience and evaluators, team leaders, you know, those that adapt methods will know only too well then how this then can become part of an evaluation summary report, you know, and feed into senior decision making. You can see why it's attractive. However, what I'd like to do is just challenge us a little bit and say, on my next slide are some other examples. So, excuse me. If we can try to move beyond linear categorization of contribution, I think that would be amazing. I think if we can start to think about typologies, that's what I would love, and try to give more detail to the roles of the different contributors, really bring the story to life. One paper I'd highly recommend is No Royal Roads by Rhonda Schlangen and Jim Coe. I don't know if you have that, but this particular material is taken from Smart CSO Lab, so thanks to them. You don't need to, you can probably see a little bit of the detail, but it's generally to give you a flavour and to break up all the words on a slide, of course, just to say that if you start to work, particularly with multiple actors, and you're evaluating the work of multiple actors, perhaps you're evaluating the work of a coalition. If you start to think about who is the broker in that space, who is the gardener, perhaps who's the pioneer, you know, that's another word, who's the one that takes forward and pushes the boundaries in order for others to come in, you know, then there's the questioner, acupuncturist, I forget what that person does here, uses windows of opportunity to target key leverage points. So, there's just lots of definitions out there, but if you can start to think it even as, again, if you think about it as part of a complex system, it might even be less of a typology and more of a topology. So you've got a landscape and you start to map your different actors who have different roles in the contribution. So, and then you can see, well, I can see then why that would then be useful to a senior team if they understand, we're taking consistently more of a convener role in this space. And this seems to be our, well, comparative advantage for want of a better word, but that seems to be what we do well in this sector. This is how we are supporting other development partners, other actors in order to move forward this agenda that we have. So I think that's very useful. And again, really draw your attention to the No Royal Roads paper. You know, that really explores this tension between wanting clear answers about investments and, you know, the natural inherent, you know, the uncertainties around how social and political change happens. So I think, you know, Rhonda Jim really managed to articulate that, and they've got even more examples of roles and even more examples of how you may want to understand contribution, which takes me to the left-hand side, the little table, if you can see it okay. I'm sure you'll be able to zoom in later if you need to. So what I've done here is, again, building on the idea that the high-level table where we looked at the different factors and then the contribution, you know, the different ratings, you can actually do something a bit even stronger and look at strength of evidence down one side and extent of contribution along the top. So was the contribution critical? Was it important? Was there just some contribution? Or was there no contribution? So you start to say, matching that with your evidence. So it was a critical contribution and I've got strong evidence, you know, or actually I only have some evidence. So I'm more confident than not that they made a critical contribution to the outcome, you know, but there are these gaps. And then really being open, and many times I've included that. There's just limited evidence, insufficient really to support a contribution judgment at this point in the story. But, you know, again, if you're part of a department, part inside an organization that's interested in contribution analysis, if you develop a contribution story, you know, you can go back to it and you can look at it again and you can extend it. Something else I mentioned earlier on was a timeline. That's been, I haven't got a picture of that, but that's extremely useful. So, you know, your classic left to right time frame, and up the top. So if you split your page in half, up the top, you could have actually where the specific actor has been involved, what they've done, critical accomplishments, barriers, or opportunities. And then in the bottom, for example, if it was an evaluation concerning multi-country evaluation, and you were doing contribution analysis across each of those. The bottom could be the country context. So for example, the G7 took place, and how you were involved prior to that with agenda setting. The role of your actors up the top could come into play. So really nice on one sheet of paper, really helps you then to refine your context and look for gaps in the story. It also meant that I went back and did a further search of press releases and sort of general with the aid of dear Google, looking at what else could be found around the time of a G7, for example, and one of them or might even have been G10. And so you can then look back at what evidence was shared with you and what went publicly, again, just to start to really get into that contribution. So, that's really everything I want to share with you today. I just want to finish with some of my final thoughts. I hope that has been a little bit of food for thought alongside your lunch today. But here we are. I just wanted to finish with sort of my bird's eye view, my share with you my reflection, and thanks again to CECAN for this space to do so. I really welcome it in a new year, and I really sense more and more in my work we're moving towards accepting, and perhaps that's just, again, it's who I work with, where I work, so you may have a very different perspective, but that people are accepting that if we work in these complex systems, which we do, the implications of that is that even the theories of change become restrictive, and and that we're continuing to look at impact as something that's achievable. So more and more, I'm turning my attention towards how can I actually build and support thinking around theories of transformation. Transformation, again, another buzzword. What do I mean by that? I mean shifts in systems. How do we get to a point where we can actually start to evidence some shifts in systems, that integrate multiple theories of change, because these all operate at many levels and they're all weaved together. And when you weave them together, you start to be able to explain how major systems transformation can actually occur. And as I've said, and I hope has been clear, I really feel that contribution analysis is certainly a tool I will continue to use going forward. It really has provided me and continues to provide me with a rigor in thinking critically about the relationships between central actors and activities and those other influences within a complex multi-actor environment. So I feel it's really nicely aligned with that sort of systems view. Yeah, so that's all for me at the moment. And as we all know, it's all very clear, the little cartoon, it's all very clear when you're in the room speaking with your colleagues, and then you open the door and reality hits. So yes, so thank you very much for listening, and very much pass Stuart, and welcome any questions.
Thank you, Catherine. That was really interesting. And I think what was so good about it is that for me, especially developing ideas around things like contribution analysis, I mean, you're summing up of where the rubber hits the road, really. And the introduction got me thinking. And then when you showed me the first slide of how you can present this, it really does hit home that there's an awful lot that you've got to distill down into something quite specific. And I think in terms of the complexity, I think you've got it. I mean, certainly I love the notion that we're handling the analysis that we do in an adaptive and iterative way when we're in complex environments, because that's the way that complex environments work and they need to be handled. So I thought that was particularly useful. And for me, one of the key lessons that we always put forward with complexity is you just got to accept what you can and can't know.
Yes.
But then try and illuminate with what it is that you do know, rather than getting too hung up on the idea that you've got to definitively answer all of these questions.
Yeah.
And then the last thing that I point out is your emphasis that there's a lot of the usual skills, particularly when you've got multiple agencies, stakeholders, you talk about open systems, the sort of stakeholder management and the consultancy skills are really important. But so we're applying almost our usual skills and quite often usual methodologies, but in a way that's sensitive to that complex environment. And I think that's a really important message. I'm not going to say any more, just to say thank you again, because we've got some questions here that are definitely going to take us more than the time we've got available to get through. So there's a couple of ones that are on clarification. So first of all, the terminology. Molly asked, when you talk about causal problem that you referred to right at the start, is that related to the same as or a little bit different from the notion of causal claims? And she refers to Main's 2019 paper here. So is this causal problem like causal claims? I get a sense that it's a slightly different thing that you're addressing there with the causal problem.
Yeah, absolutely. The causal problem is slightly different. Thanks for the question, Molly. Sounds like you have used or are very interested in contribution analysis. The causal claim, so the claim is where you really understand the theory behind the linkages. So do these strategies and tactics, do they result in the outcome? So the problem would be, to give an example, let me think. So the causal problem, for example, from one evaluation might have been the lack of national budget for a specific sectoral area that I was looking at. And because there's no budget, then the problem is then that they can't implement the policy. So there was a policy, but the problem was that there was no money. So it's trying to interrogate that a little bit more. I don't know if that's one example. But in all truth as well, what I found is that more and more, as I said, I use the outcome to begin with and less starting with the problem. The problem is part of the theory when I develop the theory. So I really try to focus in and scope what outcome are we trying to look at in detail here with contribution analysis. I hope that helped a little bit.
I think that, yeah, that clarifies the difference. And I think there is, we've got quite a lot of stuff on causal claims. I think there's stuff on the CECAN website that gets into that. But I do understand the difference between what it is that you're going for. We've got quite a lot of interesting questions around the challenges that there are to doing this kind of thing.
Yes.
So that's quite interesting. I'm just looking for the one that sort of sums it up, but best of all, on the challenges. And there was one, let me just double check for this.
I'd love to know if it's resonating with people.
It is very much. I think the minute people start talking about the challenges, I think that means it resonates, because they're thinking, how am I going to do this? So they really need to get it out. So yeah. So Andrew Shaw says, thanks for a valuable overview and the lessons. And then saying that gathering evidence from policymakers, particularly senior policymakers, is always a major and recurring challenge, and that sometimes we just know it's literally impossible to get access to the people that you need to in order to complete a credible contribution story. I mean, is that your experience, Catherine? And how do you deal with that? You did talk a little bit about incomplete stories and incomplete evidence. Yeah. So, those impossible situations, what advice have you got there?
Yes, that's a very good question. So without giving any sort of client confidentiality things away, I would say that being in certain situations where a very prolific philanthropist was definitely involved in opening doors, but there was never any way that I would be able to evidence that bar a meeting in a calendar, if somebody had shared that with me. But what we were able to do was and I just can't say this enough, it's like going back and combing through your interview data and the words people are using. And we came across a word which meant that we'd understood that one of the champions associated, so we couldn't get access to the big policymaker and the big certainly the major influencer in this situation. But through the interview transcript, we found that actually they had, one of the champions of the grantees had managed to gain access to the person that set the agenda, that opened the door to set the agenda for a G7 meeting. So then I went back and I asked the champion more detail, and I asked if I could re-interview this person who was still senior, but he was open to it. But again, some of that information couldn't be written down, but it helped understand the claim and helped to really be able to articulate the skills and capacity of that particular grantee and what they managed to do and how they'd managed to work with this champion over time, who then linked them in with the person who opened the door and made the difference. So
I think that's really good
difficult
advice. Yeah, I mean, one thing that
really
I've discovered in exactly that line is that finding out more from your initial interviewees than you could ever possibly put into the report because of confidentiality. As long as that confidentiality is understood, then if it can help you to build the story, it can then help you to ask the right questions in other places without ever giving that away. It is. But yeah, so certainly, yeah, the idea that there's a network around the people that you can't get to and remembering that exists is good. I've got a couple of questions here that I'm sure are going to take us to almost to the end of the question, but let's try and keep the answers relatively short, then we can get another one in.
I'll try.
But this is about sort of unpicking what happens around contribution analysis. If there are competing explanations for what happened, how can you sort of synthesize and weigh up evidence across all the sources when there's competing explanations, even if it might be pointing, you know, at the same thing, but particularly if it's pointing at opposite things. And then something which which is very much linked, that I've struggled with a lot, is this idea that if you know that there is more than one agency or more than one influence that's happening in a particular situation, then in some senses that might dilute the contribution that you're giving to you know, that you say that you can reasonably attribute to the organization that you're dealing with, because you know that there are other people in the game, as it were. But then the opposite explanation for that is, well, maybe they were both needed there, and that if one had been there doing its thing without the other. So how do we explain and discuss either the competing explanations or the competing agents, as it were, within contribution analysis? Any tips on that? And people are interested. That was just a name check. That's Finley Green that asked that, and Fraser McLeod. There were two questions that were linked together.
Thanks, Finley and Fraser. Good questions. There's no magic. There's no magic here. It's tricky, isn't it? So I think for the first one, in terms of really unpicking that contribution, how to weigh all that up. I mean, the first thing I do is I cast my net wide. Like you know, going in with trying to speak to as many actors as you can in that space. You know, at the moment I'm casting further again in another piece of work for additional development partners that people think are perhaps well, more irrelevant, but actually I want to hear from them what their situation, how they see, particularly if so this piece is around some technical assistance work. So how are they involved in this space at this point in government? So I think really starting casting broad, and then keep on doing your analysis and keep on having, I think within an evaluation team, I always like to sort of identify a thinking partner. So I don't know if that makes sense. So somebody with whom I can spar. So like, this is what the analytical, this is what's coming out for me. What do you see? What do you hear? And then, so you then take that. And again, it's about your own approach, but then I would be very open and discuss this with the client and listen. I mean, as much as it's not ideal, sort of discussing different factors with the client, discussing different alternative explanations, and really trying to steer yourself from them and from your own experience down to understanding how things really weigh up in the end. And then briefly on the other point about more than one influence, again, Stuart, I'll check you on your word attribution. I think it's all about contribution here. It's all about the contribution. I would say, if that was you, Fraser, I would say have a little look at the No Royal Roads paper. For me, it's about the roles. You know, go into the roles, because the reason I highlight that is because it is a problem. Because it is an issue, it is difficult. If you've got all these players and you're trying to define the contribution of them, but if you start to think actually about the role that they're bringing within that, then that really opens things up and helps understand the broader picture. Or that has been my experience anyway. Thank
you. You rescued me with the vocabulary there, because that idea of roles actually gets you out of that problem of whether it's complementary or parallel. as it were.
Yes,
And I think that's a
yes,
really, really
yes.
nice way of visualizing that.
Yeah.
So I think we've probably got time for one last
One more.
question in there,
Let's do
but it's
it.
quite a general one that I'm sure will be useful to everybody. But in fact, it's focused around commissioners of evaluations. So any tips for commissioners of evaluations who where those evaluations would be using contribution analysis? I think that's quite a nice sort of wrap up, isn't it, really? What are the main things to look
that's so
for? And just
nice.
before you answer that, Catherine, because we may get
Yes.
cut off,
Oh,
I need to
yes.
promise for a lot of questions. I need to thank everyone for attending, and thank you again.
Thank you so much.
And then we also need to remember to put the references, every reference that you've mentioned,
yes,
we'll make sure we get off you, and we will put it on the CECAN website on the same page as the video goes up. So that's where people can find those references you've mentioned, because there are a few papers there that people were interested in getting hold of. So we will do that so people can rest assured that that'll be on the page. And now, so if you've got a sort of wrap up advice, particularly for commissioners, but I guess that everybody be interested as well.
Yes, and very quickly. So, dear commissioners, those of you that are out there, I think the first thing I would say that it always starts with the questions. So what are your evaluation questions? As much as you really want contribution analysis to be used, really, do start with thinking about what are my evaluative questions? What techniques perhaps do I want to employ? And if you're starting to think along the lines of evaluative monitoring, for example, so an accompanying process to a larger initiative, then, I would definitely think about contribution analysis and think about it in terms of coming up with these stories, and that stories perhaps can become a catalogue for you. You can have a story on a particular outcome one year, perhaps one in another year. Those can be complemented by broader case studies. So think about it as part of your mix. I mean, I'm a big proponent of mixed methods, so think about it as part of your mix. I would definitely recommend that. Yeah, lots more to say, but
yeah, there's a lot there. Yep, that's it. Well, that's it. We've had plenty of questions. Fantastic presentation. Thank you, Catherine. You've certainly inspired me to think about what might come next in the webinar series. I think there's something that building on this is really fascinating for those of us that are involved in CECAN, because, as I say, it really focuses on what people are doing in these complex evaluations, and where sometimes the things that we talk about more in the abstract are really being used. So I've got loads of ideas. So please, everybody, keep your eye on the CECAN website for future events to tune into. And I'll thank you once again, Catherine. And thanks everybody for attending. And please get in touch with CECAN and use our social media if you've got things that you want to ask or observations that you've got. And that's it for today. Thanks so much.
Brilliant.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Thank you. Bye.